Well, the war in Ukraine is one of the many issues dominating this G20 summit and also the talks between world leaders. Joav Toker is professor at the American Graduate School in Paris. I asked him if there would be any significant breakthroughs in Bali.
In terms of potential efforts and behind the closed doors ambitions to try and move the Ukrainian tragedy into some more constructive rails. I had the feeling watching the meeting between President Xi and President Biden yesterday that some of it, at least at the facade, was achieved. I had a similar feeling watching from distance, obviously, the meeting between President Xi and President Macron this morning. The language is, in a way, more than the banal, polite, the language of the communiques, the preliminary remarks of both presidents, both for the US-China summit and the French-China summit. So I think there is goodwill. I think there is a common recognition by major world leaders that something has to be done in order to stop or at least divert some of those very bad energies which are right now over the Ukrainian battlefield into something which would resemble more of the diplomacy, negotiations. Perhaps the term is not yet negotiations, but rather discussions, to do something in order to put the protagonists on a discussion orbit.
How significant is the France-China relationship, and how would you characterize the state of the diplomatic relationship as it stands now?
Well, it's a rough period on international macro relations, and even before the war, before February of this year, the beginning of the Ukraine-Russian war, due to the COVID crisis. And let us remember that even before the COVID crisis, there were unpleasant moments in the relations between China and the EU in general, but specifically France and Germany and Britain to some extent, although Britain is not member of the EU. So these are relatively rough times in comparison to, say, the period, let's say, 5 or 10 years ago. So the language is more rigid, and the possibilities of great breakthroughs in bilateral and multilateral agreements is perhaps more reduced now than a few years ago. Having said that, and again to the impression I expressed a minute ago regarding the goodwill and the ambitious tone of at least President Xi, President Biden, and President Macron, I don't speak about others, there are chances that something may come out of it. It perhaps won't be visible right away, and it may stay in sort of an intermediary state of affairs before concrete things could be traced down, and perhaps diplomacy will talk rather than cannons.